We've seen in human studies that certain foods are processed by your microbes in a way that they can make depressive symptoms worse and make them better. Like, for example, citrus foods have been shown to boost mood. Anytime somebody's like, well, what is the best diet for me for this? Like, it's actually like there's a very like simple, really boring set of eating patterns, behaviors that are beneficial for almost every single disease out there.
Today's guest is Dr. Trisha Pasricha, a physician researcher who specializes in gastroenterology. Trisha is an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School, a practicing gastroenterologist at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, the director of the Institute for Gut-Brain Research, and the Ask a Doctor columnist for the Washington Post. Her new book is called You've Been Pooping All Wrong: How to Make Your Bowel Movements a Joy. So Trisha, thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited about this conversation. I want to say that reading your book was a joy. It manages to be both deeply serious and genuinely funny, which feels like exactly the right combination for a book about this subject.
Thank you.
On one page, you're citing research from the New England Journal of Medicine, and then maybe on the same page, you're cracking a hilarious fart joke.
Yeah, you can't write this kind of book without cracking a few poop jokes in there.
And obviously you have the gravitas or the authority to write such a book, which, I feel like you need. There are obvious cultural taboos against talking too openly about the bowels. And because of that, we don't discuss them nearly enough relative to their actual importance in our daily lives. And you open the book with an anecdote about highly educated patients coming to your clinic with these debilitating gut problems, but they're so embarrassed they can barely describe their symptoms. And like one of them is like shocked by the idea that he would even like look at his own stool. So my first question is, what drew you to gastroenterology in the first place? And how did you develop this passion for understanding and talking openly about the human digestive system?
I was inoculated really early. So my father's a gastroenterologist, and he is not just a regular gastroenterologist, but he was one of the first neurogastroenterologists, which is a subspecialty within GI that studies the gut-brain connection. And I grew up with this father who was so fascinated by everything that he did in that field. He went on to become a big sort of researcher, and he opened up a lab that was funded by the NIH. And the way he looked at the bowels and talked about our guts, which was like every day, was never in this like embarrassed behind closed doors, like we need to keep this like for decent society. Like it was never like that. Like he just talked about it like as it was this normal subject because it was part of our bodies and he wasn't ashamed of it, and like we shouldn't feel ashamed of it. And that's how I grew up thinking about it. And I also I've never seen anybody who is as excited and passionate about their jobs as my own father. Like the research part of it really caught hold of something like deep inside of him. And every time he had an exciting discovery that he'd found in the lab, like he told us all about it, and he got us really excited about it too. And so by the time I showed up into medical training, like I thought I always wanted to do gastroenterology, but it is true that when I became my own independent practicing physician on my own, I would say the words that I had learned, I'd become trained to say in medical training, which was like, well, tell me about your bowel movements. Well, how many bowel movements are you having a day? And it wasn't getting me as far as I wanted. Like patients were uncomfortable coming into my clinic. A lot of them were already so embarrassed. Like it was like hard. Like I'm a younger female physician. A lot of the patients like just didn't feel like I was the right person to talk to about their poop. And then I was using this language that, and granted, and then there was like a lot of the other patients like thought I was like the exact right person, but sometimes using that language that was like really formal, really medical, like stopped people from saying what they wanted to say. And we treated it like this like weird entity. So one day I was like, let me just try this experiment where I just say like, what does your poop look like? And I did that once just to like see what would happen to this person. And it was like the very first time the entire clinic was that they smiled and they laughed. And I was like, whoa. And then the rest of it, they were like, oh, well, like it's tough. I hardly poop at all. Like a week goes by and I don't. And then suddenly I was able to have like this real conversation and get to the bottom of things, no pun intended, which I would have never gotten that relationship with them, built that trust if I had just stayed like really uncomfortable myself and like not used that language. Granted, there are some people who would rather die than say the word poop, and that's fine. I try to read the room, but like, so if somebody leads with a word that they want to use, like, frankly, the word doesn't matter to me. I just want people to feel comfortable. But I have found that if I seem really comfortable using whatever language people are using in real life, then people feel more comfortable to like actually talk about it, rather than speak of it as this like, like highly intellectual entity out there in the world that we're not actually both doing, hopefully, at least every day.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I remember when I was a teenager, and I went to my primary care physician, and I had some issues, with that whole GI thing, and she said something like, how many times do you have bowel movements? And I was like, I was so confused. I was just like, and yeah, I mean, at some point I realized what she meant, but it's just such a, it's such a funny medicalized way of talking about things. I mean, so you're saying like actually in your medical training, they don't, this is not something they tell you to like, it's better to say poop. Like they kind of assume that you're just going to say bowel movement, and that's how it's done.
There's no course on like linguistics and like how to make people more comfortable. But, I will say I should probably do this study. People have done studies of other terms in GI. Like, for example, one of the bigger things like so talking about poop is embarrassing. I get that. Within that field, talking about something like fecal incontinence is probably the most embarrassing thing that someone feels that they want to talk about. But it's also very common, like 1 in 7 people experience that. And they've done these studies that if a doctor asks about fecal incontinence, this like very medical sounding, painful word, people are less likely to talk about it than if you just like call it what it is. Like, for example, if you might say, well, how many times do you have like some accidental leakage, or do you ever poop your pants? Like, if you just say like normal words, people are more receptive, and they have studied that and they've shown it. And I think it's like quite real. Like, you can just feel the whole atmosphere of the room change. And like, yeah, I get it. It's like a little weird for a doctor to say poop. Like, I haven't seen that often, but I like, but it's also like, I'm here to just get your trust and to help you. And if using the right language is like the way to do that, like, great.
I think, language makes a big difference. Although if you have to mention leaking or something, I'd have a hard time just holding in my giggles.
Yeah. Well, like, I think the more you can laugh in a GI clinic visit, like, probably the healthier that relationship is that you're having. If everyone's like super, super serious and we're talking about like farting, I don't know if you're having, like, you're going to get the most out of it.
For sure. So you've written an entire book about how we've been pooping all wrong. What's the most common mistake you see in your patients when they come into your clinic in terms of how they're pooping? Is it the timing or the posture or the diet or something else?
There's so many different things. I mean, I think the most common problem is diet. That is probably the most difficult to fix. Like, it's hard to change what we eat, but 95% of Americans are not meeting the recommended fiber intake. Fiber is like the most, like the number 1, 2, and 3 most important thing you can do for your gut. We think about fiber as being like a gut health kind of supplement or something you need to eat to just help your colon, but it's so much more than that. Like, so we think about fiber as being like a prebiotic, meaning something that the microbes in your gut feed upon. And you want to feed those microbes every single day. And so you either need to boost the fiber intake or the fermented foods, which also microbes really thrive on. You need to boost that either in your diet, or I sometimes tell people, like, just start with a fiber supplement like psyllium, something like that. And not only does fiber, especially soluble fiber, help you have more easy bowel movements, but the microbes use fiber to produce these compounds called short-chain fatty acids. Those get absorbed by your bloodstream, and then those go on to have anti-inflammatory effects well beyond your gut, like in your brain. It can help protect against dementia, it can protect your heart, help prevent cardiovascular disease. So it's really important for your overall health and not just gut health to eat more fiber, but none of us are doing it. 95% of us are not. And a lot of that is linked to the fact that we're eating so many ultra-processed foods, which are notoriously low in fiber. But the other thing, which my lab has spent a lot of time studying that we're all doing wrong, which I think is a little bit of a simpler fix in some ways, is that we are spending too long in the bathroom because we're bringing our smartphones in there. And so my lab looked at this idea that like we all know we're doing this. I guess we should just talk about it, but we're all bringing our smartphones into the bathroom. We were not doing that 10 years ago. We weren't doing it 20 years ago. Our ancestors were not doing this. Now, it is true, we have been reading in the bathroom since like the dawn of time. And so reading in the bathroom is actually like not inherently villainous, I don't think. I think it's important to have something that helps you relax because you have to relax to have a bowel movement. Like the final stage, you're straining, you're pushing, you have to relax or those sphincters aren't going to open up for the world. Reading something like gentle in the bathroom can help you do that, but the smartphones distract you from the task at hand. So we did this study where we found that people who spend more time in the bathroom on their smartphones had a 46% increased risk of developing hemorrhoids. Hemorrhoids are something that like everyone kind of knows what they are. They kind of know they don't want them. They're these engorged veins that can bleed just right at the end of the rectum. I think that's the tip of the iceberg, though. Like, I think what we do when we bring our smartphones into the bathroom is that we're sitting in this open bowl. There's a lot of passive pressure without any pelvic floor support. And I think we're sort of like retraining those muscles to paradoxically contract when they're not supposed to be contracting. And then that's going to make it even harder to have a bowel movement later on. And then just that passive sitting causes those veins to engorge. And that's what we think is what's leading to more hemorrhoids. So I think the like dynamics, the ergodynamics of how we're having bowel movements has like changed in not a good way. The simplest fix is to leave your smartphone outside the door and just like bring back the old fashioned bathroom reader, which is like just like a bad magazine that's like 3 weeks old. It's like really not going to hijack your brain when you read it. You're just going to flip through it for a few pages and then move on with your life.
Right. So the problem specifically with the phone is that it's so distracting that you are not attending to like the sensations or the actions that you're supposed to be normally making.
Yeah, so one of the questions we asked in our study was whether people who use their smartphone in the bathroom accidentally spend more time sitting in the bathroom than they intended. And that turns out that's very, very common. And that's by design. Like all these social media apps, they're designed to make you lose track of time. But if you find that you're just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and like listening to this wonderful podcast, like you should pause after 5 minutes and say, you know what, let me just listen to this on my desktop. Let me like do this, like, or just for goodness sakes, like pull my britches up and put the seat lid down and keep listening. But you don't have to sit in that compromised position and keep doing what you're doing because it's that position that is putting all this passive pressure without the pelvic floor support that you don't want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, that mirrors so closely what people have been saying about good sleep hygiene, right? Like one of the things you also talk about in your book is just having this like daily conditioned kind of reflex,
Yes.
this daily regular thing. And so with both sleep and pooping, it's like two of the most important things are get rid of your cell phone and do it at the same time every day.
Yes. And you bring up a really good point that the colon is unlike a lot of different organs in your body in that it actually has a very sensitive circadian rhythm. Like the neurons, the nerve cells in the colon, they have that intrinsic clock. And a lot of if we think about other organs in our bodies, like our kidneys, for example, when you go to sleep, your kidneys are continuing to filter the blood just as they were when you were awake. That doesn't change at all. Your lungs, you're still breathing, your air is exchanging, oxygen is exchanging, doesn't change. Your colon stops working. It goes to sleep. It enters this quiescent sleep when you're sleeping. And when you wake up, it too wakes up. So that's often why people like very commonly go to the bathroom the first thing in the morning is because that's that first hour or 2 hours when you wake up is when your colon is going to be the most active during the day. You get another kick later on when you eat. So eating triggers contractions of the colon. Exercise, movement triggers contraction, and then very famously coffee triggers contractions of the colon. So a lot of people drink coffee. And if you can build this habit where you try to combine all of these different behaviors that trigger the colon at once. So you say, I'm going to, within that first hour, 2 hours when I wake up, I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to have a cup of coffee. You do all of these things stacked on each other, then you are setting yourself up for success. The amount that you have to strain at that point is a lot less. And if you were like, it's 3:00, let me try to go, your colon's not quite contracting, so you're not ready. And then you're like straining your eyeballs out. You'd have to do way less work if you just trained yourself to listen to those cues at the right time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, I mean, that very simple fact that you pointed out in your book, which is that we don't generally poop in the nighttime. It's remarkable, right? Because it's if you asked me like, do you poop in the nighttime? I'd be like, of course not. But it's like something that's never ever been articulated in like my entire life to me. I've never articulated it to anyone else. So it's just amazing that such a basic fact of our existence goes unacknowledged at all.
Thank you for appreciating your colon. And it's true that, like, yeah, we often wake up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom to urinate. And that's because it's like your kidneys don't stop working. They're filling up your bladder. And so you'll go. And it's actually a good moment to call out, like, if you are waking up to poop, to have a bowel movement, that's a red flag in my books. Like, nobody should really be doing that unless you have some kind of disorder. Maybe it's an inflammation or something else that's pushing stool out in a way that's overcoming that circadian rhythm. So if that's you, you actually probably should talk to your doctor about it and let them know.
Right. I mean, unless you know what, maybe there's a specific like thing that caused it, like maybe you had too much Nashville hot chicken or something, right? And that would explain it.
I love Nashville hot chicken. Tell me, are you a fan?
Oh, no, I mean, I mostly know about it through your book.
It's so good. So deadly, though. Yeah, I never used to eat. Well, I did once and then I regretted it. But I stopped eating Nashville hot chicken like the night before a big test. You have to be really careful.
Yeah, you actually talk a lot about spicy foods in your book. When you were growing up, your dad taught you the reason why like people from hotter climates eat spicier foods. And
yes,
it's actually quite implicated in all these like disorders that people might have in their gut.
Yeah, that's right. So the kind of phenomena that my dad was fascinated with, and he ended up studying the underlying biological mechanisms. But I was at, why is it that people who live in hotter climates, their cuisines tend to be spicier? So you might think about like Thailand, India, Mexico. We all love our spicy food. And sometimes in areas where it's like a little bit colder, like Northern Europe, the foods are a little bit more bland traditionally. I will say, like, you know, Indian food has taken over the globe. But one reason why is that those foods, when you eat them, we've all experienced this, you start to sweat. Like, your body responds with ways to cool you down. This happens to me all the time. Like, I start to sweat, my nose starts to run, I become this big mess, like halfway through my hot chicken. And the reason is that, and this actually one person who discovered the receptor responsible, like it garnered him the Nobel Prize in medicine or physiology. There's a particular receptor, it's called the TRPV1 receptor, that mediates heat perception and pain perception, and it actually is triggered by capsaicin. And figuring out that receptor was triggered by capsaicin is how they actually understood what that receptor was. But what it means for you when you're sitting around eating your spicy chicken is that your body is literally responding to this as if it were heat temperature wise, like it is a flame. And so you're cooling down as if your body's like on fire. You've put something really fire in your body. And in a way you have, like, it's funny that our language even reflects this. Like, we say this is like a really fiery dish, and our bodies are certainly responding that way. The reason this becomes relevant to a gastroenterologist like myself, or like my dad, who became really fascinated with this, is that, as it turns out, that same receptor, which can be triggered by the capsaicin that's in spicy food, immediate heat, also mediates a lot of different kinds of pain. And that pain that we see in a lot of common gastrointestinal disorders like irritable bowel syndrome can be linked back to an increased elevation in TRPV1, that same receptor. Now you might be like, well, so is the way to treat my IBS to eat like more spicy food? And like, I wish I could tell you that is the simple answer. There actually has been a lot of like studies, especially in preclinical studies, that show that eating spicy food actually can have an anti-inflammatory effect to it. So there are studies that like eating spicy food is good for your overall health, but there is like a little bit of a flip side, which is that spicy foods like this can also like really cause bad reflux and like can also like cause like a little bit of inflammation in your stomach well before it hits your colon. So that simple solution doesn't work for everyone, but if you're like me and you just enjoy it from time to time, there is like some overall health benefits to just eating spicier foods.
Yeah, it's pretty. Yeah, I mean, we can talk more about this later, but the book really talks about, like, dives into, there are these like fascinating experiments. Some of them were done by your dad, which basically discovered that these exposures to pain during childhood in these mice actually had long-lasting effects into adulthood, and may explain the origins of IBS in humans. But before we move on to that, I want to ask more about just pooping mechanics, right?
Please.
So the book emphasizes. So I guess one of the takeaways of the book is like, you should never hold it in. If you need to go, you should just go. And
yes,
there are some big downsides to holding it in.
Thank you for bringing that one up. That is a big message.
And you actually devote a whole chapter on strategies to overcome anxiety about pooping in public restrooms, whether it's like your dorm or, the hospital that you work in. But so the thing that I've always wondered is like, what if the bathroom itself is like legitimately disgusting, right? Like, say I'm on a
Yeah.
road trip, I
Yeah.
suddenly need to go, and the only option is a gas station bathroom, and my instinct is just to hold it in as long as I can until I find a clean toilet. Am I being overly cautious, or is there a real medical risk to sitting on a dirty gas station toilet?
That's a really good question. And you're probably, I mean, I think everyone has that instinct to not want to use the gas station toilet if we could. Like, nobody chooses to be in that situation, right? But I will say that, so the risks, there are infections that can be spread through poop. That's like a very common cause of foodborne illnesses is like, like someone goes to the bathroom, they don't wash their hands, then they prepare food, and then like they get
Hmm.
everybody who they cooked food for sick. Like, that's possible. Just using the bathroom and then thoroughly washing your hands afterwards, which you should do. Don't you dare not wash your hands after using the bathroom. Then you're going to be fine. Like, as long as you go for like the full, like, sing happy birthday twice, like,
Yeah.
you're going to be okay. It's gross. I get that. Like, it probably will not smell like what you want it to smell like. But the risk of not going is that you're going to hurt yourself more if you now have to wait like 4 hours, 6 hours, because the poop that you need to have right now in the moment when your body is contracting and saying like, look, we got to go. That's what that sensation of I need to go is your colon contracting against a closed door. Like, that door being your sphincters. Your sphincters are closed. You have control over that. You don't have control over the contractions. The contractions are just going to happen. But you're like, no, this is not a good time. We have to like keep this door shut. 5 hours later, that same that same poop has been sitting there. Your colon has been drawing water out of it because that's your colon's job. All it does is suck everything dry. So it's a drier, harder, firmer, more cracked looking poop. So that's harder to push out. And now 5 hours later, your colon is like, I give up. I tried. You didn't respond. And so now it's not contracting. Now when you want to go, you're like, this is a safe, comfortable, clean bathroom, spa-like atmosphere. There's some poopery that I can spray afterwards. If your colon's not ready for it, if it's not contracting, and now you have to do all the work for the team, so you have to strain, do these Valsalva maneuvers, and it's a harder poop than it was, like, this is going to be a way more difficult bowel movement than it was if you had just responded when you should have. And that's why, and I say this in the book, that's why humans and dogs are really the only creatures on earth who experience constipation. Like, outside of like certain medical conditions like that other animals might experience, we're the only ones who have really house trained ourselves into believing that there's a socially appropriate time to do this very normal bodily function, and there's a socially inappropriate time. When I think if we want to just all live our best lives, we should respond whenever our body is telling us it's the right time to go, rather than saying, "Oh no, I'm at my friend's house. What will my friend think? Will they know I do this thing that they do too?" Like, just
Yeah.
go. They're your friend, for goodness sake.
Yeah, so just to be clear, the main danger of unsanitary bathrooms is you spreading your own like norovirus or whatever if you don't wash your hands and you prepare food. But I'm wondering, is there a chance of like catching something from your bare butt being on the bare toilet seat? Like, is that ever something that you have to think about? Because they provide those like paper collars that you put on, and most of the time they kind of, as you sit on them, they like fall.
I hate those paper collars. Like, who likes those? Who feels like that's even a good idea? Like, I don't know. There haven't been any known documented cases of getting like a disease from just like your butt touching the toilet seat. But it's all like, it doesn't mean it's like hypothetically impossible. Like, certainly, like, yes, if a little bit of bacteria lands on your butt, now your hand touches that butt, gets that bacteria on it, and now you go like smear it on your face, like, maybe. However, you should keep in mind, one, if you hand wash, you're okay. Like, as long as you're washing yourself, you should be fine. And then two, bacteria doesn't just like linger forever, right? Like, if somebody did something unsanitary on that seat, like, those bacteria just like out in the open will die on their own. And like, their half-life is like, might be different. It's hard to predict that. But all of this is to say the odds of you getting an infection, even from a really nasty looking gas station bathroom, I am not saying this is my number one choice. It is not. But the odds of infection are really low. And I would rather have you, like, pay this like very tiny price for like
Right.
what I hope is going to be a 2-minute experience than like suffer for the next 12 hours because now you're constipated and like the trip that you've been traveling, like you get to your destination and you feel ill and you can't really enjoy yourself.
Right, right. So if the choice is between gas station bathroom and waiting 3 hours for an ideal bathroom, you would go with the gas station bathroom every single time.
Yeah, I'm trying to think like how nasty it would have to be that I would be like, you know what, it's worth the price later. It's a personal call, but I would just go.
Yeah,
I would
you
go,
would
I
just
would
go.
cleanse thoroughly, and I would move on with my life.
Right. Okay, okay. I want to talk about poop texture. In the book, you mention this thing called the Bristol stool scale,
Yes.
and you single out type 4. So it goes from I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You single out type 4, which is quote smooth and soft like a sausage, as being
Indeed.
maybe ideal. Would you say?
I would. Well, that's what, when they've done these, so the Bristol stool scale was developed in Bristol, England. And one intrepid gastroenterologist, then it became group, went around and tried to ask all of the residents like what their stool looked like, and then tried to correlate these different types. And the scale, you know, goes up to a 6-point scale for being kind of dead center in there, like not too fluffy and soft, not firm and pebbly like little rabbit pebbles, just somewhere nice and in between. Those are the ones who seem to, if they had that form, seem to also be happiest with their bowel habits, like didn't feel constipated, didn't feel like they were having diarrhea. That doesn't mean necessarily that that's the right stool for all of us. Every single person should be aspiring to a 4. Like a 4 is great. Like we all know what a 4 looks like. It's like that ideal poop. It's like the wipeless wonder. Like congrats. It's great. But this was England in like the 1960s, 1970s. If you were somebody, when this scale was developed, if you're somebody who eats a high fiber diet, which a lot of us aren't, like the average American is not. But if you maybe go to other parts of the world, like Eastern India, where they've also looked at frequency of stool and what those things look like, those guys are actually having more fluffy, more frequent, slightly looser stools. And they consider that perfectly normal. And that's simply because if you eat more fiber, you're going to have fluffier, softer stool, and you're going to have it more frequently. I often tell people, like I kind of try to warn them, like, don't panic if that happens. Like that's just embrace that new you. Like this is healthy to have more than one a day. But we as Americans, we've been holding this like one a day goal in our minds since like around the time of the Civil War. It's not based on any real data. Like one a day is great. 2 or 3 times a day is great too. And even every other day could be fine as long as you're comfortable and you're meeting all of your nutritional goals.
Yeah, I've noticed in my own experience the most satisfying poops are the ones that are completely wipeless, right? Like you wipe and there's almost nothing. And so you would say that's like that corresponds to type 4 or below, like 4, 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, but it's also true that like you can have like a way harder stool that's like you don't need to wipe up for that, but you had to like strain for 10 minutes to get it out. I don't think you're living the dream if that's the case.
Right, right. Okay, yeah, I want to talk about something interesting that you mentioned earlier, which is the microbiome.
Yes.
One of the things you write about in the book is that our poop is mostly made up of bacteria, living and dead bacteria. So 55% of our poop. How does the microbiome affect our gut health, and what does it mean to have a healthy or an unhealthy microbiome?
That is like an incredibly important question because the microbiome, when we talk about gut health, it seems like the microbiome has dominated the conversation. And really, microbiome research really blossomed within the last like 2 decades or so. It's a new science, like in the scheme of things. Although we've learned a lot, we also have a lot that we still need to learn. So what we do know is that we have trillions of microbes that are living in our guts. And those microbes play a very big role in how everything that we put into our gut is processed. So if we think about our colons, for example, you have these cells that line the colon that make up that first layer, but those cells, on top of it, there's this like pretty nice thick mucus layer that kind of protects you against like whatever kind of things you might throw at it from what you've eaten. And then often somewhere in that mucus layer is where all of the microbes are residing and living. So really, the first line of defense is not you, it's them, it's the microbes. And so they take the food you've given them, and ideally you'd be giving them foods they thrive on, which are fiber, which are fermented foods. And then depending on what it is, they're producing different metabolites or different compounds. And so we have found that if you feed them things like that are a high fiber diet, specifically a variety of different plant-based sources, then the bacteria proliferate and become more diverse. And they produce more of these beneficial compounds called short-chain fatty acids, which, like butyrate, we often hear about in different studies. And those get absorbed into the bloodstream. And then those can exert anti-inflammatory effects in your heart, in your brain, for example. But all of that started based on what the microbes had decided to do or not decided to do. And then there are some foods that you might eat where the inflammation from those foods, like for example, a lot of ultra processed foods or processed meats, for example, sugary beverages, those things might break down that mucus layer where the microbes are living and trying to survive. And then when you break that down, when you disrupt the microbes, then suddenly you're exposing the lining of your colon, and those gaps between those really tightly lined cells start to open up, and that can be really problematic. And so you want to protect that layer as much as you can of those microbes. And they're not only producing these metabolites that are anti-inflammatory, but they're also influencing our mood. And like that's the part of things of my field, which is neurogastroenterology, that's become probably the most exciting over the last decade or so, is really how much the microbes and how they then interact with the nerve cells in our gut can influence our brain and mood and depression and anxiety. We often think about, traditionally, we had thought about depression and anxiety as originating in our brains. Then when we feel stressed, it causes our colons to contract and we get diarrhea. And all of this is also true, but we're learning that the other way around is quite possible. And that those microbes in the nerves in our gut and the interactions that they have can play a big role in neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's, which is what my lab studies, or Alzheimer's disease. So it's a big two-way street, and it's really exciting. People tend to want to put microbes into this box of like good bacteria or bad bacteria. And I almost never call something good or bad because we just don't actually know, what these microbes are for us. Is it that the bacteria itself is so bad, or is it because the soil in which this garden you're trying to plant is just like not the right soil for these bacteria, or like, so certain diseases may have one bacteria that's more predominant than another, and then we might label them as bad. But actually the problem could be the food that you're eating that's causing those to thrive. And those bacteria are actually trying to protect you. They're just growing more often in this like kind of bad environment that they've been placed in. So all which is to say, we don't know yet fully what are the good or bad bacteria per se in a lot of conditions, but that's probably tailoring treatment to specific microbes is where we want the field to go. The wellness industry has like gone 10 steps ahead of the science right now. And like, they'll tell you we're already there. They'll tell you like, we can already fix your personal microbiome with this supplement that is, will be $1,000 and it's tailored. We're not already there. And we don't quite have the data in large clinical trials that show that we know exactly what we're doing. And you can think about it this way, like, I often liken our microbiome to a garden. Like if we say like, look, you've got all these bacteria that we know are associated with these diseases we don't want. Let's take a probiotic. Like, let's just throw some seeds of good bacteria on there. But that soil is the problem. Those good seeds aren't going to take, and you're just going to keep proliferating the quote bad stuff. And it's not because it's bad bacteria. It's just because that's a bacteria that thrives in the environment you've created. And what you really need to do is back up and say, what is it about this environment that's off? Is it the food that I'm eating? Is it the medication? Is there something else that's causing this to thrive? So I hope in the next 10 years, we're going to be there. We're not quite there yet, but it is like an incredibly exciting time to be in neuro GI and to be studying all of these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that, that analogy with the garden is really instructive, because if you think about like an ecological system, there's all these complex kind of feedback loops and nonlinear dynamics, and like even at this point we don't really know how to properly manage like a forest or something, right? So actually in the book you mentioned this fascinating study where researchers wiped out these mice's microbiomes with antibiotics, and they The really weird thing is the ones who were really into exercising, so they have like, various propensities to run on their treadmills, and the ones who were into exercising lost the motivation to exercise. And I think that's really, really suggestive. But as far as I know, we can't make a person depressed, which is what these mice were, simply by giving them antibiotics, right? So like, I guess, given what we know, or like, what you can speculate about, like how much, in what ways does the microbiome directly affect our psychology and mental health, and, like even personality traits like degree of motivation?
Yeah. I think it's not as simplistic as like, oh, eat this food and your mood is going to go off, or eat this one thing and your mood will get better. But it is true. Like we've seen in human studies that certain foods are processed by your microbes in a way that they produce these metabolites that do influence depression. And I say influence because depression, like you kind of alluded to earlier, with lots of biological processes, it's not one thing. In a mouse, it's one thing you manipulate, there's one outcome. In a human, there's 20 different things, 200 different things happening at once that will influence that outcome as someone goes through their daily life. But we have seen in real human studies that certain types of food can make depressive symptoms worse and make them better. Like, for example, citrus foods have been shown, and the mechanisms have been shown to be mediated by the microbiome to boost mood. And so I think the problem is that sometimes, like on social media, the people pick up on that, or the headlines pick up on this, and they're like, oh yeah, eat one grapefruit a day and your depression will go away. And that's too like oversimplifying it. But I also don't want to like sort of overshadow how cool the science is, that there is a role for food and the kinds of foods we put in our body to certainly have an impact on our brains. But we need more time to get there. Like I said, in the scheme of things, microbiome is that field of science and medicine is young compared to how long we've been studying the enteric nervous system, which is a nerve system. For about 100 years, we were studying the nerves in our guts and actually like didn't really know that we had these trillions of microbes living in there that were playing such a big role. So just imagine how much we're going to learn in the next 100 years. So it's not today. And like, don't let anyone tell you online that it is today, but maybe in like couple of decades, we are going to be able to say like, this is the kinds of foods that like you should eat that will certainly like that could influence your motivation and your depression. Now, I also think like we have the backbones of that data already. Like anytime somebody is like, well, what is the best diet for me for this? Like, it's actually like, there's a very like simple, really boring set of eating patterns, behaviors that are beneficial for almost every single disease out there, like Parkinson's disease, cardiovascular disease, colorectal cancer. All of these come back to foods that are high in fiber, high in whole grains, leaner proteins. And obviously this is a newer phenomena, but fewer ultra-processed foods. The Mediterranean diet is probably the best studied, but just to be clear, like you don't have to eat Mediterranean food. It's just that is the pattern of eating that like really emphasizes plant-based foods, whole grains, etc. That's the healthiest way to eat that's been shown by the most studies. Like we don't actually need to wait 100 years to know what do we have to eat, what's the pattern of eating that's going to help us live longer, feel better. We already know that. It's just like, it's not the answer you want to hear. Everyone wants to hear it. Oh, if you have 2 grapefruits a day, that's going to be the thing. Like that's what I want to hear too, but it's not it.
Yeah, I guess part of the reason it's so difficult to pin these down in experimental studies is because there's so much variation among people, and even within the same person, like at different stages of their life.
Yes.
So maybe the grapefruit won't work for you, but maybe it will. And I guess you can just try it for a few weeks and see if you feel better. And the other thing you said about fiber and psyllium. So I recently started taking psyllium because I was told I need more fiber.
Yes,
and
good.
I found it just because I asked a large language model. I just asked like, oh, what are the sources of fiber? And it was like, oh, you can eat this or this or this or this. And I was like, well, how much fiber does it actually have? And it was like, oh, if you eat like half a carrot, you get 2 grams. I was like, that's not,
yeah.
I'm not going to eat that many carrots. And so, long story short, it's just, I realized just by talking to this LLM, like psyllium is just way more effective. It's just like, grams of soluble fiber per serving compared to like anything you could eat. So I was pleasantly surprised that you gave it such a prominent place in the book when I rarely heard about it.
I'm glad you're making a positive change. I mean, this is the whole sort of problem with fiber is that women are supposed to get the formal guidelines are like women under 50 should get 25 grams of fiber per day. Men should get 38, right? And that number can really slip away from you. Yeah. It's like, when I have people describe like, they're like, oh yeah, I eat a high fiber diet. I'm like, okay, just describe your breakfast, lunch, and a routine. They'll be like, well, I have cereal for breakfast. Okay, breakfast cereal is very common. It's like the most popular breakfast food, pastries, bagels. You're not getting any fiber. Then it's like lunch is like a sandwich and a bag of chips. Well, shoot, where's the fiber there? And like that that one piece of lettuce that you put on the sandwich, like that's not it.
That's nothing.
Then yeah, you're like putting all your like money and hopes and dreams on the vegetable you might have at dinner. You're not going to get to your 38 grams doing that. And so, while I do think that the best way to get fiber is through that diversity of plants in the diet, I take psyllium every day because there are some days I don't even meet my fiber goals because, I'm just living out my best life, but I do meet them when I take psyllium every day. And psyllium, it's like, 1 teaspoon is going to get you what you need. And it's been so well studied. I'm like a little bit on the extreme end. Like I take a lot of psyllium and I also like the unflavored. Like I mix it in coffee and I chug it because if you leave it in water, you might have experienced this, it'll turn into a gel. That gel is what you want. So psyllium is a soluble fiber, meaning that when it interacts with water, it forms this gel. That gel is the thing that makes it such a shapeshifter and will help you. If you're constipated, it'll also help you if you have diarrhea. So it'll add bulk to your stool if it's too loose. It'll soften it up if it's too hard. So it really helps to kind of make you regular, make things more normal. But when it turns into that gel in your small intestine, it's basically drawing in cholesterol. And so your body has to produce more cholesterol because it's being sucked up and it's sucking it out of the bloodstream. And so it lowers those levels overall. So it's good for your heart health. And then by the time psyllium reaches your colon, then it has all these other benefits that I talked about once it starts to interact with your microbiome. So I'm glad you're eating it. I think it is hard. I mean, I think that's why 95% of us are not meeting our fiber goals. But I also think when I tell people to eat like a higher fiber eating pattern, people immediately sort of think of like this sad life of kale salads or like, oh, how many carrots do I have to eat, right? And I think you can just have a sense of like, what are the high yield things I can do? Okay, so like a fiber supplement is great. Eating like a serving of green beans, like French green beans, is not going to get you as much fiber as a serving of peas or Brussels sprouts. So like sometimes I say like all you should do, if you're eating vegetables anyway, make it a high fiber vegetable rather than a low fiber vegetable. Or see if you can add like some crunchy, like crisp up some chia seeds and add those to something like there are ways that you can add fiber in rather than like take something away. And I think sometimes that can be helpful, but unless you're deliberate about it, unless you're thinking about it, like that number is going to get away from you.
Yeah, for sure. So obviously one of the benefits of psyllium that you talk about is it's fuel for our microbiome. And the book actually talks about how the microbiome, its composition is mostly set by the age of say 2 or 3. So it's shaped by all these different factors, like whether you're born via C-section, whether you're breastfed, if there are pets in the house. Like that seems like a pretty narrow age window, right? Like if someone's microbiome gets off to a bad start in those early years, to what extent are they permanently stuck in that state?
So there's good and bad news. Like the bad news is that like our microbiomes are the most malleable in the first few years of life, and those are like 0 to 5, and those are also the years where like we have the least amount of control over what's happening to our environment. Like it's set by like, the environment we grew up in, like what we're eating, which we're not choosing, like we're just eating what's put in front of us kind of thing. The good news is that as adults, the most powerful way we can change our microbiome is through what we eat. And the studies have shown that like when we make a dietary change, like a change to our eating habits, maybe that's by adding more fermented foods in. A lot of these studies came out of like a big lab at Stanford. It takes about 8 to 12 weeks for our microbiomes to really shift. But the good news is that they shift. They will stay that way as long as you sustain that habit, right? The problem being that often we tell people like eat more of a Mediterranean style diet, eat more high fiber, and people go from 0 to 100 in like 2 weeks. They're miserable. they can't sustain it, and then they stop, and then nothing's going to have changed within those first 2 weeks. It has to become a habit that you stick with. So rather than say like you've got to eat 38 grams of fiber, Kai, like, you know what, why don't you just add 1 teaspoon of psyllium to like something you're drinking anyway, and if you can sustain that over several years, that's like that's better for you than like just eating kale salads for 2 weeks and giving up. But on the flip side, you know, the nice thing about our microbiomes being like a little bit more rigid as adults is that there's this fear that if we take something like antibiotics or we get sick with like a gastroenteritis, that we've wiped our microbiomes out. And actually, the good news is that the studies have shown that it's possible there's transient changes, but even without us doing anything, not taking probiotics, like not eating something totally new to try to like, you know, revitalize, your microbiome is going to bounce right back. And it takes about like 2 or 3 weeks when you do these things, but it does. And so you actually, like, that is actually a protective thing, but it means that like the only real way that you can meaningfully impact it is to change your diet and to do that for the long term.
So then, given what you know about the critical role of early childhood environment on the microbiome, is there anything specific that you do with your own kids,
yes,
in those early years to make sure that they're set up properly? Like, do you give them psyllium supplements?
I don't give them psyllium supplements but I fiber max them. Like, I micromanage my kids' microbiome. So like one thing we did, which won't work for everybody, but we got a dog. Like, we got a puppy right before we had kids. This wasn't the only reason we got a puppy, but it wasn't like not a reason to get a puppy. But kids who grow up in households with dogs like have a way different microbiome than people who don't have these kinds of house pets. And like, I mean, you could just look at the way my dog licks their face and they're fluffing up the dog. Like, they clearly share one microbiome and everyone's eating the same food off the floor. But even if you don't get an animal, and there's lots of reasons why you might not be able to, kids who grow up on farms tend to have a hardier, more robust microbiome than kids who grow up in the city and like industrialized areas. And this is, I'm not totally sure about like the right dose, but I do very intentionally take my kids to our local farms like all the time, like at least once a week if we can. It's not going to be the same as a kid who grows up on the farm, but at least I get them to interact with the animals there, because it, you know, studies have shown that makes a difference. Plants.
Yeah. So when no one's looking, you're just like,
here's this goat, here's my baby,
pig.
Please lick.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I let them play. I mean, I wash, like, you know, like we do all the stuff, like we wash our hands, we sanitize afterwards, but inevitably those microbes from the animals are getting all over their clothes. It's getting into their environment, and that's what you want. Plants in the house can help make a like healthier environment at home, and so that's big. And then I think the biggest thing is to get them on fiber and eating a high fiber diet early, and eating as few ultra processed foods at a younger age. So there are these really popular like pouches for toddlers. Don't get me wrong, we eat those from time to time, like we live in the real world, but those aren't our staples. Most of the foods the kids eat are whole foods. That doesn't mean they're eating like the most expensive, like from Whole Foods. You know, like we eat frozen vegetables and we cook those, which are very cheap. We eat beans or legumes, which are also like pretty cheap. But we try to get them to eat whole foods, and we really try really, really hard to make vegetables and fruits really fun for them. So they eat pears, they eat kiwis. With training, it wasn't always easy. They, like every kid, go through these ups and downs of like kind of like not wanting the same vegetables that they used to like, or not wanting fruits anymore. When we were like, what are you talking about? You were a blueberry kid for so long. Why do you not want this stuff? You know, but like we sort of like really try to make it fun. We had them cut out fun shapes of their fruits, and like, anyway, so because of all this effort and like sticking it out, they are meeting their fiber goals. And I think that one thing we have seen, not just in the US, but globally, is that more and more young people are eating more ultra-processed foods, drinking more sugar-sweetened beverages. When you do that at a younger age, the studies have shown that these things set you up for early onset colorectal cancer. And that's not to say, like, there's not a world where I'm blaming kids or parents for eating these foods, because that is what like our food environment pushes on us. But it's certainly a risk factor for these diseases that really scares me, probably because I diagnose these cancers often in my own practice. So I'm very mindful to not try to habituate their taste buds to ultra processed foods, because then your body is going to crave that degree of added sugar. It's so high. 90% of the sugar intake that we have comes from ultra-processed food. It doesn't come from table sugar. So if you're used to that, if you're used to that salt, like the salt content is very high, those are the foods you're going to crave. So we try really hard. Again, we're not perfect. Like, our kids know what pouches are. They eat pouches. But that's not their mainstay whenever we can help it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense. So one of the things you've talked about is this thing called the enteric nervous system. And
yes.
From a scientific perspective, I think that was one of the most interesting things in the book. Kind of, you describe it as this network of neurons that's embedded along the GI tract. And some people call it the second brain, but you actually are offended on behalf of the ENS and point out that it's actually the OG brain because it was here way before, it was here in our evolutionary ancestors way before they evolved brains. Can you talk about why calling it a second brain actually undersells it, and what is the function of the enteric nervous system?
Yeah, thank you. I am indignant on behalf of the ENS. So the ENS, short for enteric nervous system, is just what you described. It's this network of nerves that lives along our entire guts, from our esophagus, stomach, small bowel, large bowel. And in a lot of organisms, it was there before the central nervous system, which is the brain, is what we think of as the main brain in our heads. But if you go back and look at some of these early organisms like jellyfish, for example, they're making smart decisions out there in the wild. They know where to get their food. They know when to swim away. They're deciding what direction to go. They're moving in groups. But you can see right through their heads, and there's no brain in sight. And the reason that they're doing all of this so well is because they have a highly sophisticated enteric nervous system. And this connection between the enteric nervous system and the brain became more and more robust as we evolved. But we actually don't need a fully functional central nervous system to survive. We need a functioning enteric nervous system. We have to eat or we don't survive. You do not need to write poetry. You'll survive if you don't write songs and listen to the Beatles. But when these two things are communicating with each other as species like humans and others, they do really well through this big nerve called the vagus nerve. Then a lot of the magic happens. And that's what the entire sort of neuro-GI field is the gut-brain connection and understanding how these two things influence each other. And there is this for whatever reasons today, even though we've known about the enteric nervous system for decades, nobody learns about it in school. We only learn about the brain, and the brain doctors, the neurologists, think they're the most important organ. The heart doctors think they have the most important organ, but truly you would die immediately without us, without the gut and without the enteric nervous system. So I think it's the OG. I think evolution shows it's the OG. But I think it's also true that when these two things are both working harmoniously together, everyone's lives work a little bit better too.
A big part of your book is about the gut-brain connection, and you make the point that most of the communication occurs in one direction, which is from the gut to the brain. And you also talk about your father's landmark study where these newborn rats are exposed to this brief amount of colon irritation, and somehow just from that short exposure they develop this lifelong hypersensitivity to pain. So that's kind of suggestive of the origins of irritable bowel syndrome in humans, right? It's really striking to me how just this small transient event during a critical window can permanently rewire these pain pathways. What do you think these experiments actually show about human subjects?
So the study that you're referencing is this idea that when you have these newborn mice and you give them this mildly acidic substance to irritate their colons, irritate their stomachs, and then nothing else is different. You feed them the same as their litter mates, you give them the same sleep-wake cycles, they grow up completely happily. The ones who experienced a few days of transient irritation grow up to express more depressive-like behaviors, more anxiety behaviors. And the study in mice really proved a mechanism. It said there is nothing else different about this group of mice and this one than the fact that we did something to rewire their enteric nervous system, and then that connected up to the brain, and they proved that too. So that's how we prove mechanisms in science. In humans, there's almost no world in which we can isolate just one difference in one group of people and say they're exactly identical to this other group of people, because everyone's living their own lives in their own environments. But researchers have tried to approximate this the best that they can. And so there was a study in humans where they looked at siblings, paired siblings who grew up, and one baby at birth had, for example, their stomach suction, like a little bit of mechanical trauma to their stomach right at birth, but then grew up in the same household as their sibling. Like theoretically, nobody's childhood is the same as their siblings. We all know that, but similar environment, same parents, probably ate very similar foods to some extent. The ones who had that trauma to their stomachs, which they would never remember, right? Like they are like hours, like seconds old. They'll never remember that to save their lives. They grew up to be more hypervigilant, hypersensitive than their siblings. And, I think every gastroenterologist knows this from other epidemiological studies. A lot of our patients with IBS or irritable bowel syndrome, when they're asked, they had a moment of trauma. They can identify it. They can tell you like, yeah, I had this very stressful period of my life when I was growing up. And whether or not they tell you what that was, it can be psychological trauma. It can be physical trauma. Like sometimes maybe they were in a car accident. Maybe there was like some other big infection that hit them, like COVID, for example. Actually, we saw so much irritable bowel syndrome after COVID, and we're still seeing the effects of that. It rings true, with the experimental data that we see in mice where we prove the mechanism, but we see those patterns in humans as well. And you're right that I think you can develop new irritable bowel syndrome based on some inflammatory event, psychological trauma or physiological trauma in adulthood. But when that happens in childhood, it can just be so much more profound. And what makes it really difficult is that you often don't remember what that trigger was. You may feel for most of your life like you don't know why you are the way that you are. And sometimes we can learn what it is, we can understand it, sometimes we don't. But sometimes just knowing that possibility exists, it's not like something like inherently wrong with you, it's like something that just happened, can help us sort of think about like, how are we going to treat it? Like, where do we need to address the source of the pain and the irritation is, are we going to give you a medication that acts mainly on the gut, even though maybe the gut's healed now? Do we want to give you a medication that acts on the central nervous system? That's an option too. And so it can help us sort of decide where we need to stop the source of the signaling.
Yeah, that's a pretty terrifying thought that you can have such a profound influence on somebody's nervous system development with, such a small intervention, right? Like, in terms of raising kids, there's this like innate tension in parenting where you want to protect your children from harm, but you also recognize that they need to learn from mistakes, fall off playground equipment, skin their knees. You want resilient, resourceful kids, even if it means you have to go to the ER every now and then. But now that I've learned about these studies where these newborns get like anxiety and hypertension from like a stomach suction, it makes me wonder whether some of these mild childhood injuries or illnesses that we brush off, they might have like much more lasting effects than we realize, right? Like as a scientist who studies this and as a parent, how do you think about that? Like, are there specific injuries or illnesses that you're particularly vigilant about? Like, do you try to avoid like food poisoning at all costs for your kids before the age of 5 or something like that?
I would say no. First of all, I think you can't avoid food poisoning. I wish you could. But I think the more we try to prevent harm, sometimes it can only make the parents' anxiety worse, and it doesn't necessarily actually prevent any of the harm at all. I think we need to try to protect our kids from the real dangers, right? Like one of the things I talk about in my book was like burn injuries. That's a really big deal. Like a burn injury, when you get it at an earlier age, it will make you more sensitive to pain in other parts of your body later on in life than if you got that burn injury later on. So these like big things we want to be really mindful of. When it comes to the gut, the enteric nervous system is unlike any other part of your body. The closest thing that I try to do to protect the lining of their gut, to protect them from injury, is to just feed them well and feed them with foods that are not inflammatory and ones that help protect them. But I am also like very much of the mindset that like kids, they do need to explore their own boundaries and they need to, become resilient by being pushed a little bit. But, we want to protect them from physical harm, but there's only so much we can do to prevent the inevitable. What we talk about a lot, though, just to be really clear, in IBS is trauma. So there's no world in which I would ever Like, will let my kids walk into a traumatic situation, and nobody would, like no parent would. And like, so that's like one set of like things that I think like hasn't changed over time. But some of these minor injuries, I don't think are the ones externally that we can control or should even be trying to control, because we're just going to make our own anxiety worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I guess stomach suction, if you can avoid it, try to avoid it.
That shouldn't be the take-home point. There was probably a very good reason that they had to suction their stomach. Well, you know, it's like,
Okay,
I mean, you
fair.
make a good point. Like, I don't think there is a black and white answer to this, because, you know, like, we don't like to, you know, like we don't love that this is the case, but the data is pretty clear that, for example, kids who are born via C-section have a different microbiome than kids who are born through vaginal delivery. And that's not a reason to not get the C-section, right? Like the decision to get the C-section in the moment is almost always to do with the baby and the mother's health in that moment. And if you start to make that decision based on some future event that you actually don't know if it will or won't happen, maybe there is a higher risk, you could end up doing more harm than good by making a bad decision in the moment. And that's kind of how I think about, like, for example, someone who goes that study where they got the gastric suctioning, they got it because they needed it in the moment. There was some risk that they were trying to avoid. So I think we can't slip into territory like where I think you're making as a parent, always trying to make the best decision you can in the actual moment to prevent something from becoming a real trauma. And sometimes that's a trade-off. I mean, that's life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the things that really struck me about your experiences with your patients is that sometimes they come to you with these debilitating gut problems, and every test actually comes back normal. So, you know, maybe they're told by some other doctor, not you, that it's all in their head, or you know, their symptoms are kind of dismissed. Do you think this is something that's like unusually pervasive in gastroenterology? Or is this a general like medical thing?
It is definitely general, but it is a big problem, specifically in GI. And there are certain entities, irritable bowel syndrome being one of them, which are so incredibly common. Like as many as like 10-15% of the population have IBS. But for something that disproportionately affects so much of us, we know so little about. Even though in this book, I talk about the breadth of how much we do know, and that's a lot, there's still so much we don't know. And there's so much that we haven't translated yet from the lab, from the bench, to actually making a difference in patients' lives. I think there is a knowledge gap that's fixable and like immediately helpful to patients, which is that I think there are a lot of GI doctors out there who just aren't even familiar with the number of different proven, easily available therapies for IBS. But there's also a big leap we have to take, which is to say everything we're calling IBS is probably not one disease at all. It's like multiple different things. We need to really subtype and categorize what this is and then target our treatments accordingly. But because IBS for so long would be this entity that you diagnose after you get 20 different tests and they're all negative, doctors would say, well, if everything's negative, what else could it be but stress, but a mental health problem? And certainly people who have IBS have more depression, have more anxiety than somebody who doesn't have a chronic disease. But that's true for every chronic disease, right? It's true for rheumatoid arthritis. It's true for cancer. It's true for IBS. It doesn't mean that the anxiety and depression is causing the IBS. And as we show in the book, like we have lots of good evidence to show that in fact, the gut problem is probably what is often driving the anxiety, the depression in a lot of different patients. So IBS is not the only disorder in medicine that's like this. Like there are a number of different disorders. One of them is fibromyalgia, which the rheumatologists deal with. The neurologists have a lot of different diseases. In fact, I would posit even migraine is often treated this way. And it's literally in your head, but it's often sort of dismissed. And like people get told often like, well, this is stress. And that's because there's no like blood test for migraine. There's no like scan that will tell you that's what you're dealing with is migraines. And whenever that kind of disconnect happens, people start to be taken less seriously. And I think probably in the next like decade or so, we're going to start to have personalized tests that really show this is the exact etiology in your particular case. And I hope that will open minds, but I also think we shouldn't have to wait for that because, you know,
right.
The data is there enough that proves that this is not in your heads, but it is a real tragedy, probably disproportionately faced by women and minorities who get told this, but really everybody.
Part of the argument you make is that a lot of these diagnostic tools even if they're not widely available now, they might actually be in clinical trials already. And sometimes patients with these symptoms that don't show up on the normal test do get specific test positive in a clinical study. So if we imagine like this perfect future where like we have all these diagnostic tools, might there still be problems that are sort of irreducibly non-physical? So I'm thinking about an analogy with mental health where you can have real psychological suffering, even if there's nothing structurally wrong with your brain in a scan. So since the gut is I don't want to use the term second brain, but it's sort of a brain of its own, right? Like, could there be something analogous to like psychiatry for the gut? Like, it's not about finding a lesion in the gut or something like that, but like, can you imagine a future where you treat the gut as an organ that can have its like own form of psychological distress?
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're getting at is the difference between pain and suffering, right? Pain can be objectively created. Suffering is so closely tied to our emotions and specific parts of the brain, like the amygdala. And somebody who has been primed differently throughout their own experiences in their lives might experience the same like sort of like prick in their arm that you would experience, but they will feel that they're suffering because of it, even though perhaps the degree of pain that we are creating is equal for both of you. And sometimes what we try to treat in the gut is to increase the threshold at which the nerves fire, the sensory nerves, the nerves that perceive pain. Sometimes when we have an infection or some other kind of trigger, that threshold is lowered, so they react more quickly to lots of different kinds of triggers in our environment. And some of the medications we give them increase that threshold. So the same sort of trigger no longer sets them off and says, okay, let's signal to our brains that we're in pain. But even when we treat with those medications, we're not really getting at the part about suffering per se, because that's part of our psychology and that's part of our emotions. Even if, there's no longer a signal coming from our gut that's saying we need to react this way. Or maybe there is, but it's at a lower level. And that's where treating pain becomes so complicated and so beautiful, which is that sometimes we do in GI, we treat things at two different levels. Like we treat them with a medication that will change the threshold of those nerves in the ENS, the enteric nervous system firing. And then we also treat them with medications that will act at the central nervous system. And sometimes those are traditionally classified as antidepressants, but we're using them for pain and for suffering. And so that we actually do have like sort of different tools in our toolkit that we can do to modify or modulate those responses. But it is really important, I think, to walk into it having an understanding of how pain signaling works and how it's processes and why you're offering those medications to patients, because otherwise all they're going to hear is, oh, you think I'm depressed. Like, you think this is all in my head. That's why you're giving me this antidepressant. And that's not really like what we're doing, but it can certainly read that way if you've been dismissed your whole life as like your suffering not being real.
Yeah, that's really tricky. I want to talk about research. You're the director of the Institute for Gut-Brain Research at Beth Israel. What are the big questions that you're trying to answer?
Yes. Well, so my lab, we're studying a lot of different things, some of which probably the biggest one that, I don't know if it's not necessarily the most important question, but it's the one that caught the most media attention is like our work on smartphones and using smartphones in the bathroom. But what my lab is trying to study that I think is like maybe the more serious question, although not necessarily like more ubiquitous, is Parkinson's disease, how Parkinson's disease can originate in the gut and how we can treat it. So the like big goal, and we are like many years away from this, but the big goal would be to see if there are ways that we can treat and catch Parkinson's through biomarkers and signals in the gut before the disease reaches the brain. And if we're able to do that, then, which we're not yet, but we're working on it. If we're able to do that, are there ways that we can intervene to stop it from traveling upwards? And so what we think is wrong in Parkinson's is that there's this protein called alpha-synuclein, and it misfolds. And when it starts to misfold, it like almost like infects other cells and causes their proteins to misfold, and it kind of works its way upwards. And traditionally, we've thought about that protein misfolding in the brain, in a part of the brain called the substantia nigra, and it sort of kills off the neurons that produce dopamine.
So sorry, is it a prion disease then?
It acts very much like it. It's not a prion disease, but it's a good question. But the way the misfolding propagates sort of has been described as prion-like. we started to do these studies in the 1990s where we found that people, before they develop Parkinson's disease, their guts might be riddled with misfolded alpha-synuclein. And some studies in mice, which showed this very conclusively, but then also you can look at epidemiological studies in humans, have shown that if we cut the vagus nerve, that big highway that connects the brain to the gut, then you are less likely to get Parkinson's disease. And we used to do that procedure called a vagotomy, where we cut the nerve for bad acid reflux. We really don't do it that often now because we have very good medications for acid reflux. But because we did that for so many years, we saw that the people who got that procedure were less likely to get Parkinson's. And we see in mice and in other studies that the alpha-synuclein that can start by some trigger in the gut. We don't always know what that trigger is, but it could be something like an infection, maybe something in our environment that enters our food. It starts the proteins to misfold and it travels up the vagus nerve and then ultimately hits the brain. So that's what my lab is studying, is trying to see what are the early changes in the gut that we could maybe recognize early on in the disease. And then we're also studying what are the ways that we can treat all of the GI symptoms that go hand in hand with Parkinson's disease. Because as you can imagine, if the enteric nervous system is so affected by that same protein, well, they must have a lot of GI symptoms, and they really do. 80% of patients with Parkinson's disease have constipation. They have really bad nausea and vomiting. And sometimes the medication we treat people with, which is medications that produce dopamine, those actually can aggravate the problem, because we think about dopamine as like this reward pathway, this like involved in addiction and pleasure in the brain, but in the gut, it does so much more. And that's also what my lab is studying, is like, what does dopamine signaling in the gut look like? And one of the things it does is it protects against ulcers. It can slow down how your stomach empties and moves. All of these things influence the symptoms that they have. And we try to tease apart, are the symptoms that you're having because of the medication you're taking or because of the disease for which you were taking that medication in the first place? And that can be tricky.
Yeah, I mean, that's really fascinating, the idea that like a brain disease like Parkinson's is ultimately caused by what happens in the gut. And that's definitely something that I was not aware of before reading your book. So you mentioned throughout the book that like so many of these breakthrough discoveries in neurogastroenterology were funded by the NIH, and including those of your own lab. Given the current political environment where we're seeing both actual funding cuts and like all this uncertainty around funding for medical research, what is well, first of all, how do you feel about that?
I feel really bad about it. I feel really scared for our field. I mean, it's a real problem, because a lot of the people who were cut at Harvard, the first to go were the trainees, like the postdocs, like those positions, they were no longer able to fund them. And if we cut off the pipeline of future scientists, which we did both like literally by like not having positions, but then also kind of psychologically, like we have really scared a lot of people from wanting to go into science because the career pathway now feels very uncertain. Like there's no way we can sustain this entire academic endeavor. It's already really hard to do science in academia. It's already very hard to be a doctor who does science because, one, it's like a really long-term haul to get for the hope of a discovery, and you're constantly trying to apply for grants from the NIH. That's really difficult. And you're cutting down time that you're seeing patients. You're cutting down time that you're doing procedures in order to do science. So in some ways, it's a noble endeavor, but if you're made to feel like it's there's no hope, there's no future for it, like, people will do it less and less. So anyway, so I feel really scared that we are going to sort of like shut off the faucet, that pipeline of people who would go into the field, and we're not going to know what the impact of that is for another 10 to 20 years. And then I think when we see the discoveries suddenly start to taper off, like we're going to still get discoveries in the next 1 or 2 years because all the fruit of the work that's been happening in the last decade is going to start to pay off soon. And then there's going to be this drop off when suddenly there's like less and less that's been in the pipeline. And then we're going to feel it in this disconnected way 10 to 15 years from now.
Yeah, that's really sobering. And it's, it's sad that we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot in this way. So my last question to end on a happier note.
Thank you.
Your father, your father shows up in so many ways in the book. He's, as a scientist who's made fundamental contributions to in your field, and as someone who held forth and educated his kids at the dinner table, as a mentor who taught you how to believe in your patients. Can you talk about his influence on you, not just as a doctor, but also as a person?
That's a really sweet question. I mean, he's had a huge impact on me. I mean, I think he's certainly what inspired me to go into this whole field. And it's funny because and now I get it now that I'm a doctor, like, even though he wanted to inspire that spark of discovery and that love for science, which he did, like, without even trying, just by being so passionate about his lab, like he did that. He was always like, kind of like, oh, there's more fields out there than just medicine, and there's more specialties out there than just neuro-GI. Like, it wasn't like he was ever really pushing for me to do exactly what he did. But I kind of walked into it just because I like admired so much what he did, and I saw that same unmet need. But he's right that, like, one thing I have learned now that I'm in his boat, that it is like it's a hard field to be in, because you're often fighting against so much dogma. You're like, being an academic researcher is really difficult, but I do think it's ultimately, I see why he stuck it out, and I see why I'm going to stick it out. The other way that he has influenced me too is that he, like, one of his big sayings is basically that, he gave me and my siblings like a really wonderful life. Like, he and my mom gave us an incredibly great childhood. We had like lots of opportunity, and they're both immigrants, and I think this is like a little bit of the immigrant mentality. But he also said, like, we've given you so much. If you have from people who have given a lot is expected. Like, don't waste these opportunities that we've given you, and you need to give back in some way. And like, that's something he says like every week. You can't have a conversation without him like reminding you that you have to give back. But it stuck with me, and like, so I think that, like, I could have gone into a lot of different fields too, but I think part of going into medicine and then even becoming a researcher is a way of saying, like, I don't have all the answers. Like, I want to have answers for all my patients. I don't have all the answers, but by being a researcher, I'm at least saying I'm going to try to be part of that solution the way that he does. And so that's probably, I mean, it all ties together, but that's the big way that he's influenced me.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, Trisha, I think that's a great place to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining me today and for writing such an important and entertaining book. I think a lot of people are going to find this book genuinely helpful, and I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you, Kai. Thanks for reading the book. This was a great interview. You clearly read the book, which is very nice.
Yeah. I try to do my research.
Yeah, you did. You were awesome. This was fun.